In this video, we'll have a look at how do you externalize the configurations using Spring Cloud config. Now, we used to write the code where we combine the environment properties into the application source code itself. So for example, if my application wants to connect to database, so we'll have like dev.properties, qa.property, uat.properties, everything bundled as part of the source code itself. Now normally what we do is we when we deploy this var to the dev environment, the var will still have qa.properties everything, which is not required. So what we can do is we can externalize the properties outside of this application source code. So this way we can actually build the var once and then deploy it into multiple different environments. So build once, we can follow this build once and deploy anywhere pattern. So how can you externalize the configurations from the application source code? So we can externalize the configurations by storing the configurations in a database or in a Git repository or any other mechanism. So you can also put that in database, but if you use a Git repo to store the configurations, then you have a history of who changed what. So that is one advantage of using a Git repo. So in this video we'll have a look at using a Git repo to manage the properties. So normally you need three things in order to externalize the properties. The first thing is where you want to store the properties. So normally, I mean, in this video we'll have this as a Git repo. And the second, the other thing that we need is the client, which will actually read the property values from the Git repo. But there is a one config server. The config server takes care of binding the application, that is the config client, to this client repo. So this config server is the one who actually talks to the Git repo and gets the values, and the config client reaches out to the config server to pull the values from the Git repo. Okay, so in this video, so we have three repositories. One is xconfig, which is the config repo, xinfra server, which is the config server, and the client, which is nothing but a food service. Okay, so if I go here, so I've already created one project where I have the Git repo. So you can see that I've created one YML file which manages the properties. So you can see that this is the variable config test name is a simple property which will have something. You can actually create something like application-qa.properties, application-uat.properties, etc. Okay, now the second step is you need to create a config server. The config server is the infra server. So for this, what you may need to have, you need to add the dependencies for the config server. So I'll add the dependencies. So I added the dependencies for the config server. The second step, what we may need to do is you need to enable the config server, and the third thing that you need to do is you need to tell that, okay, so we are going to run this application in our local. So there'll be two applications running in local. One is the client and the second thing is the config server. We'll run config server on port 8080, or we'll run the config server on port 8888 and the other server in port 8081. Okay. Now the other thing that you need to do is, now the config server needs a way to need to know which Git repository it needs to connect. So for that there is a variable that you need to value that you need to set for the properties. So the one that I need to set is xconfig.get, which is exactly this. You can see xconfig.get. So you need to copy the same thing over here. Okay, so now I'm done with my config server. That's it. There's no other change required. Now what I'll do is I'll start the server. Okay, the config server is getting started. In the meantime, we'll go to this client. So it started. So now we have to write the client code which connects to the config server and reads the properties from the git. So now what we have to, again, we need to add the dependencies. We'll go here and we'll add the dependencies. For this we have cloud startup config. Now the other thing that we need to do is we need to tell we need to we need to tell which where is the location of the config server. So the way you tell this is, so there is a cloud config and URI attribute, and here you need to tell localhost colon 8888. So now once we start this application, it will connect to this config server. Now before that, we need a way to test this properties. So we need to write a controller which will read this property, and then so I have created one config controller. So now I just need to say so I okay, so say test config. I don't need a path variable. Okay, so before that I need to hold this variable. So I'll say and I just need to use this. Okay, so if the property is not read, then it should be printing this default value. So config test name, so I'm just printing this and then I'm also returning this. Okay, now so what are the things we did? So in build.gradle we added the configurations, the dependency for a cloud config, and then in the application.yml we said which config server to connect to, and in this cloud config the controller, we just read this value and print it. Okay, now let's restart the application. Okay, now here we can, okay, so let's say http colon localhost 8081 slash test config slash test config. Yeah, you can see that it's being pulled from the cloud config. Now the reason why it is speaking -dev.yml is because, like, I've already set the profile to dev. So if you change this and say QA, then it'll automatically pull from the QA.properties, which we haven't defined it yet. So but if you want, you can do that as well. So now, so what are the use cases? Why would you want to use Spring Cloud config? Some of the use cases is like, obviously you need to externalize the configurations, like the environment related things, the applications that this service depends on. all the host name, port name for a database or external services, we can actually put that in a Spring Cloud config. The other thing, so you can also set the log levels in the Spring Cloud config, or you can toggle a particular feature on or off. You can do things like that in this config server. So you can see that the values are in the git repo. For example, if you want to change this value, will that be reflected in the client's application? It will not, but if you want, you can do that. There's an endpoint, a refresh, where you can invoke, and then you can get the latest copy, or you can use refresh scope, and then you can do that. So since you may want to store the password, so there is a way by which you can encrypt the passwords as well. Okay, so one of the best practices, like, you have to store only the things that are required, the things that really needs to be externalized, and not everything, or not some of the product properties make sense. It makes sense to be part of the application itself, but some you really want to externalize it. So you may want to do that. Okay, that's it for now, and see you in the next video.